guys. Alright, where am I? Why is it not showing me? Alright. So we have some catching up to do from last night, I think. Because we only just started to talk about negative dialectics. Alright, so I wanted to remind us of something that we talked about earlier in the course, and that is the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena. So let me see, I'm going to bring up our chart of terms so we can kind of go through this, look at the mechanics of it, remind ourselves of this, because it will help us navigate. Adorno's writing will help us navigate the terms and how he proceeds. So first of all, we have to remind ourselves about what the actual subject of all this is: freedom. So freedom understood how, though? So Aristotle had a conception of freedom. So if you think about how freedom was philosophized historically, Aristotle's concept of freedom is the freedom to be. So the freedom to realize nature, freedom of being. So if the acorn is unhindered in its growth, then it will realize its nature and become a tree. Right, so that's the freedom of being, the freedom to be. The modern conception of freedom, and this is something that Robert Pippin points out in his little piece on critical theory that we had in our first day's reading, but we didn't cover it in any great detail in class because of time constraints. That modern philosophy, as critical philosophy, is concerned with change. And it's not concerned with change in any sense, but in a very specific sense. Namely, change that we can take responsibility for. Change that we are subjects of, rather than being objects of change. So of course ancient peoples also thought about change, but they thought about change as something that happened, rather than change as something that we do in our freedom. So thinking about freedom in this way, in the freedom to change. But of course, change can be understood in many different respects. It can be understood as random, chance, accident. It can be understood as aleatory. But the real question is change that is intentional. So when thinking about that, then it becomes important to think about the conditions of possibility for change. And in thinking about the conditions of possibility for change, one has to also think about continuity in a process of change. So that's why transformation is both continuity and change. And because it's both continuity and change, it actually has a kind of self-contradictory character. Looked at from a certain standpoint, a process of transformation can appear to be the opposite of what it looks like from another standpoint. So this dialectic of continuity and change, dialectic of being and becoming, thinking about conditions of possibility of change and transformation, it means that the result of change, the result of a process of becoming, has this dual aspect, has a kind of contradictory aspect. So to help illustrate this rather than becoming, which is language that we had from Marx, the passage from the Grundrisse that we read on the first day of class. Self-overcoming, Selbstaufhebung. So Aufhebung, sublation. This is a word that is there in Kant and Hegel. It's also an ordinary word in German. It's not just a specialized philosophical term, but it's also an ordinary word. And as an ordinary word, it just means to take up. But self-overcoming, Selbstaufhebung, that's a Nietzschean phrase in terms of the history of philosophy. So Nietzsche, who comes appreciably later, 100 years after Kant, and nearly 100 years after Hegel, adds this twist to this idea. And indeed, he was trying to preserve, in fashioning this term, the contradictory character of contradiction. So what Nietzsche did not like about, because Nietzsche is mentioned by Adorno, so I want to bring Nietzsche in a little bit. What Nietzsche did not like about Kant and Hegel was that they seemed to resolve contradictions. They seemed to resolve contradictions a little bit too neatly. Whereas he wanted to preserve the contradictoriness of contradictions. Now, Hegel also has this idea, the ruse of reason, or the irony of history, namely that the result of people's struggles is often the opposite of what they deliberately intended. But self-overcoming allows us to get at this contradictory character of this process of transformation, in which it both appears to be self-fulfillment and self-negation. It appears to be self-completion and self-transcendence, self-realization and self-abolition. Now, Nietzsche himself did psychologize it, individualize it, illustrate it by way of the person, whereas for Kant and Hegel, this would refer more to concepts and refer to more kind of general phenomena, to social phenomena. So for Marx and for the Marxists, why is this important? Why do they key into this? Why is this serviceable to them in some way? Why is this helpful? Well, because Marx understood socialism or communism to be the self-overcoming of capitalism. So it's not just the negation of capitalism, nor can it be understood as simply the fulfillment of capitalism. It could be understood as a kind of completion of capitalism, but also its transcendence. Again, an abolition of capitalism that's also, in some way, its realization. And we've talked about that, the negativity that we talked about last night. So the proletariat abolishing itself through its class struggle, proletarian socialist revolution, but capitalism already abolishes the proletariat. And capitalism is the alienated result or phenomenon of the workers' own activity. So the workers are already abolishing themselves in capitalism. But again, in a kind of objective, unconscious way, as opposed to a subjective, conscious way. Okay, so I point that out because usually, again, process of being and becoming, transformation, change, usually refers to more abstract and even metaphysical objects rather than persons. But even the personality would be a kind of metaphysical object. So for instance, art, modern art, continues through change. Art perpetuates itself by transforming itself. And that transformation does look like a self-negation as well as a self-fulfillment. Right, so the changes within modern art, within modernist art history under capitalism, is a kind of radical process of self-negation that keeps art going. So art's redefining itself all the time, but still maintaining itself. Right, so there's something about capitalism itself that has this character, and that's important to keep in mind. Okay, so why do I bring all of that in? Because, again, how does one see transformation, the potentiality, the possibility for transformation in the present? Right, so we've had the philosophy of history by Hegel. We've had the idea of a universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view by Kant. And that was a telos, a teleology of the present that casts a view of the past retrospectively back behind itself. So the present sees its own possibility in the past. But as Hegel pointed out, Owl of Minerva flies at dusk, wisdom comes at the end, not at the beginning, and it's ex post facto, it's post festum. Consciousness is retrospective in character. What about revolutionaries? Marx and Engels, Marxists are revolutionaries. So they're trying to see something else. They're not trying to only see the possibility in the past for the present, but they are looking for the possibility in the present for a qualitative transformation. They're looking prognostically from the present, where are we going? So that letter to Ruga, one of the first things that we read by Marx, for the ruthless criticism of everything existing, we know whence, we don't know whither. We know where we're coming from, but we don't know where we're going. And all the reformers are confused. Right, and so the task of critique is about clarifying the confusion of the dogmatists, he says, and also the reformers. The dogmatists, because they have a dogmatic view of the program that they're following. And the only problem with the program they're following, that they're trying to implement, is its dogmatic character. The program itself might not be a problem, because after all, the program itself, socialism or communism, any reform program, it must be in some way conceivable, it must be in some way expressing a possibility, otherwise it couldn't come about, it couldn't happen. Right? But it might be self-contradictory in its aspiration, it might be confused, it might be unclear to itself what its actual content is. So we have to recall the general will of Rousseau. The idea that there's a transcendent will of society that goes beyond the majority will or even the sum total of the aggregate wills of everyone in society. Right, based on the idea of the social contract, so he really bears down on the idea of a social contract, which was established long before him by people like Hobbes and Locke. Says, okay, what does it even mean to say that there's a social contract? Well, what it means is that people interact, they contract with each other, they contract each other in a transaction, And maybe that transaction itself, maybe the social contract itself, has a will beyond the individual participants in it. That's the unsocial sociability that Kant talked about, again, building on Rousseau. It's also the invisible hand that Adam Smith found operating. It's also Geist and the ruse of reason, because reason is practical reason. It's always practical reason. So maybe the private reason, the interested reason of people in their activity. Behind the backs of the actors, as Marx put it. The invisible hand that Smith invoked was actually from Bernard Mandeville, The Fable of the Bees, where he said, even criminals are contributing to the improvement of society, despite their extremely selfish and antisocial attitudes. They're unintentionally contributing to society, to its development. Right? Private vice makes its contribution to public benefit and public virtue. Private vice is a public virtue. Greed is a vice, and yet it can result in virtue. This dialectical conception of society, that the result might be contradictory to the intention. That's freedom. That's freedom. The fact that we might do more than we intend to do, that's our freedom. The fact that what we do might be contrary to our intention, that's freedom. Because it's social freedom. It's the freedom of society. It's the freedom of Geist. It's the freedom of mind and consciousness, which is actually not reducible to our private interest. So public reason, as opposed to private reason, in Kant's What is Enlightenment. How does public reason advance? It advances through the limited and contradictory character of private reason. Right? The dialectic of public and private reason. All right, so how to unlock that in the present? And by the way, not only Marx was concerned about the present. So Kant and Hegel had this notion of history. That's how they articulated the movement of freedom in history, or the movement of reason in history, as Hegel titled it. But they were concerned with the freedom of their own time, too. They were concerned with realizing the potential of their present moment as well. It wasn't only Marx who was concerned with that. But we could say the emphasis for Marx is different. Why is that? Well, because the bourgeois consciousness of freedom itself came late. So Rousseau, Smith, Kant, Hegel are recognizing, recognizing the freedom of bourgeois society at the end of a process of the transformation of society, the transformation of the third estate, the transformation of the commoners from a subsistence agricultural community, guildcraft artisans, traditional kind of labor, the transformation of that medieval third estate of traditional civilization to the modern bourgeois third estate of labor as a basis for commodity exchange. Commercial society, commercial civilization. That is only becoming clear to people, the actual substance of modern society, the actual social relations of modern society. That's only becoming clear rather late in the game. We can include Locke, who said property is based on labor. All right, so recognition of the social relations of labor, 17th century in provenance, and then develops through the 18th century and reaches a kind of apogee with Hegel, whose philosophy Marx called a metaphysics of labor. So dialectical philosophy is a metaphysics of labor. It's the freedom of labor expressed philosophically. It's the profound, qualitatively transformative power of labor to revolutionize society that is philosophized by Hegel, revolutionizing our social relations, revolutionizing our relation to others, to nature, and to ourselves. Labor as the basis for that. That's bourgeois consciousness. That's the consciousness of bourgeois society, and it arrives rather late. Capitalism is the crisis of that metaphysics of labor. It is a crisis of that society, and society is a metaphysical object. It's a crisis of that general will of society that no one beforehand, a priori, deliberately conceived. Right? It organically grew out of traditional civilization and then was recognized late in its full flowering, indeed on the brink of it going into crisis with the Industrial Revolution. Right, so consciousness of society as labor came at the end of bourgeois society, literally. Smith, even Rousseau, Kant, and Hegel especially, writing during the time of the Industrial Revolution. Kant and Hegel not only great followers of Rousseau, but also of Adam Smith. Okay, so the Marxist project is tricky. It's building on this bourgeois consciousness of society, however, also recognizing that that society and the consciousness of that society is in crisis, is in self-contradiction and crisis, manifestly in the 1800s. By the 1840s, when Marx and Engels come to consciousness as adult men in their 20s in the 1840s, it is clear through the objective and subjective phenomena of their time, of society in their time, that there is a crisis. So the objective phenomena of political economy, including the emergence of the proletariat as an objective phenomenon, the social question, the newly immiserated industrial working class, that is immiserated and exploited in ways that perhaps are unprecedented historically. Certainly they're unprecedented as a condition for free people, meaning the only thing that would be analogous would be slaves, but not for nominally free people, as the working class is in bourgeois society. They're not slaves, that's the whole point. So then the question is, okay, that's the objective phenomenon, what's the subjective phenomenon? This new movement for socialism and communism by the working class. The proletarian socialist movement. That's the subjective phenomenon, that's the ideology. That's the political expression, as opposed to the more objective economic expression of the crisis. So it seems like the economics of capitalism fulfill those of bourgeois society. The profit motive. Economization of labor. Trying to make labor as valuable as possible. It's also negating the values of bourgeois society. It's trying to render labor superfluous or valueless. It's not the profit that happens through the market, but it's the profit that is engineered by the state and by massive concentrations of capital, banks, finance. The plutocracy, that was the term that was used. The plutocracy, the rule of money. Now again, it can look like that's always been the case. Actually, it wasn't always the case. So in the Middle Ages, the rich people did not run society. The aristocracy were not rich. The church was richer than the aristocracy, but they weren't defined by wealth either. Their power, their position, their centrality, their rule was not based on money. Neither was it the case that in the bourgeois epoch, starting in the Renaissance, that money simply ruled. It did not. Nor was it for Adam Smith. That's why Adam Smith talks about the landlords and the vestiges of the old aristocracy and the political role that they played, which was conservative, but that might be good because it might be a check on the unbridled rule of money, the mercantile interest. And yet, in the 19th century, that gives way. In Marx's time, it is a plutocracy. And capitalism makes that possible. It actually violates the principles, the social relations of bourgeois society for money to rule. Even for money to rule economically. That's the whole point of the labor theory of value. The whole point of the labor theory of value is that actually money does not rule. The value of labor does, at least in the historical long run. Okay, so painting a picture here because we are borrowing from Kant and Hegel's philosophy of history, even Rousseau's philosophy of history. In the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, in other words, looking back retrospectively, in hindsight, it does look like history has moved through a process of contradictions developing from within a social form that yields conditions of possibility for transformation, and that these are manifest phenomenally in appearances that are necessary in their character, that are not simply mistaken, but have some expression of fundamental truth to them. That's why Hegel can find the values of bourgeois society in Christianity, even though the triumph of bourgeois society did mean overthrowing Christianity, overthrowing the power of the church. So it negated the traditional religion of Christianity while also seeming to fulfill the principle of Christianity through the Protestant Reformation, which was both the fundamentalist return to a kind of pure Christian theology, while it is also the triumph of a kind of secularization of moral values that actually brings about atheism in practice. So, how can Marx grasp it in his own time? How does Marxism seek to grasp it in its own time? What are the phenomena? How are the phenomena approached? How are they understood? How are they interpreted? How are they analyzed? How are they comprehended? How are they grasped? Well, again, according to their contradictions. We read also early on in Marx, before we even got to the letter to Rugo, we read To Make the World Philosophical, the passage from Marx's dissertation, where he addressed his own relationship to the students of Hegel, who were his own teachers. Right, so philosophy becoming worldly as the complement of the world becoming philosophical. So that had already happened. The question is, how is it recognized? And it's recognized in a rather contradictory way. All right, it's an intention to have a philosophical politics, like a radical politics driven by a philosophy. That's the left or young Hegelians. But also philosophically, the idea that not only were the problems of philosophy curable via politics, but the problems of politics were curable via philosophy. And again, early on, 1839, 1840, 1841, Marx is working on his dissertation, right, still grasps this intention of a political philosophy and a philosophical politics as self-contradictory, and as representing a kind of disintegration and crisis of the old Hegelian philosophy, which was a philosophy of revolution, to use Korsch's language. Right, Rousseau, Adam Smith, Kant, Hegel, John Locke, these are philosophers of revolution. It's a philosophy of revolution. It's a philosophy of the bourgeois revolution. What happens to the philosophy of bourgeois revolution in the era of capitalism? In the era of capitalist self-contradiction of bourgeois social relations, capitalist self-contradiction of the metaphysics of labor in our social relations. Right, this is what we're dealing with. So philosophy itself becomes a symptom. And again, Marx talked about that in his dissertation. He said the inner light becomes an outer flame. There's a kind of pathology. There's a suffering of the philosopher. There's a suffering expressed by philosophy. But the suffering of the philosopher is not isolated. It's not only in the philosopher's head. It is a manifestation in the philosopher's own thought of a greater contradiction in the world that he lives in the time that he lives in. Right, so philosophy, the possibility of philosophy, the possibility of a crisis of philosophy, these are not just matters of thinking alone. Again, the theses on Feuerbach. The fact that society seems divided between the educator and those to be educated is itself an expression of the contradiction of the condition of the educator, in which the educator must himself be educated. As well as, of course, a condition of contradiction for those who must be educated. So, I will also point out from the ruthless criticism of everything existing, theoretical criticism does not preclude practical criticism or political criticism. Criticism of weapons, criticism of the political sphere, of the coercive state political sphere, does not preclude the criticism by weapons, namely revolution. But looked at, again, one-sidedly, if one isn't going to just bring in politics precipitously, what about philosophy? Especially when philosophy becomes seemingly untethered from social revolution. Right, the umbilical cord has been broken. That's a phrase from Korsch, from Marxism and philosophy. The umbilical cord between theory and practice has been broken. Right, so theory gives birth to practice, practice gives birth to theory. It's an umbilical cord that goes both ways, in which each is the mother and child of the other. But what happens when that umbilical cord is broken? And you're left with either the mother or the child of philosophy. Right, that's the situation that we're in. So it's a tricky thing because we usually think of philosophy as a way of thinking, a method of thinking. Think of philosophy as formal philosophy. And God help us, even to the point of like a logical formula. That's what philosophy is? No. No, Heidegger's right about that. Philosophy is thinking. It's thinking being. It's the being of thinking. It's the thinking of being. As absurdly mystifying as that sounds, it's no more mystifying, really, than reducing human thought to a logical operation, as if we are just elaborate calculators. That's just as mystifying and mystical, actually. So, again, if philosophy is both the child and the mother of an aborted transformation, of a miscarried transformation, that's the phrase that Adorno used after the attempt to change the world miscarried. Well, where does that leave philosophy? As either mother or child of that miscarriage. Right. It's evidence of something. It's a pathological expression. It's evidence of suffering in a specific way. Now again, this method, immanent dialectical critique, is itself a symptom. It's itself a symptom. That's important to keep in mind. It is itself a symptom, meaning it is the disease as well as the cure. It's the symptomatic cure, or it's the diseased health. Right? We will see that Adorno uses this language throughout Negative Dialectics. So in our reading for yesterday that we had to catch up on, let me bring up our syllabus. So I have our page numbers in front of us, and I will let me bring it up also on our announcements. I think our announcements are also a good way of getting at this. Because I got my table of contents in the PDF for the book. Alright, we were supposed to read basically from parts 1 and 2 for yesterday. That's what we have to catch up on, and then go to part 3 as well. All right, so 143 to 144. All right. Let's see. Okay. We didn't make it through everything that we had in part 1. I might actually go back to that before we do this. Yeah, because 143, relation to left-wing egalianism. Well, actually, let's start there. For reasons of time, let's start there. Okay, so here's Adorno. He says, the objection has been raised that because of its imminently critical and theoretical character, the turn to non-identity, again, to the contradiction, is an insignificant nuance of neo-Hegelianism, or of the historically obsolete Hegelian left, as if Marxian criticism of philosophy were a dispensation from it, while at the same time the East, with its cultural propensities, refuses to do without a Marxist philosophy. So that's the Soviet Union and China and the Warsaw Pact, Eastern Europe. The call for unity of theory and practice has irresistibly degraded theory to a servant's role, removing the very traits it should have brought to that unity. The visa stamp of practice, which we demand of all theory, became a censor's placé. Yet whereas theory succumbed to the vaunted mixture, practice became non-conceptual. A piece of the politics it was supposed to lead out of, it became the prey of power. This is something that we'll read about tomorrow night when we read about practice-ism and action-ism, the kind of reification of practice and the hypostasization of action. So Adorno goes on, the liquidation of theory by dogmatization and thought taboos contributed to the bad practice. The recovery of theory's independence lies in the interest of practice itself. The interrelation of both moments is not settled once and for all, but fluctuates historically. Today, with theory paralyzed and disparaged by the all-governing bustle, its mere existence, however impotent, bears witness against the bustle. This is why theory is legitimate and why it is hated. Without it, there would be no changing the practice that constantly calls for change. Those who chide theory for being anachronistic obey the topos of dismissing as obsolete what remains painful as thwarted. They thus endorse the world's course, defying which is the idea of theory alone, and the target is theoretically missed even if they succeeded in abolishing it positivistically or by fiat. Besides, this ranting at the recollection of a theory that carries weight is not far removed from the short-winded intellectual habits of the Western side. The fear of epigonality, that's like being a latecomer, that everything great is behind us, and of the academic odor that clings to any reprise of motives codified in philosophical history, has long induced the various schools to advertise themselves as unprecedented. Precisely this confirms the fatal continuity of precedent. But for all the dubiousness of a procedure that will insist the more loudly on primal experience, the more promptly it gets its categories from the social mechanism. Thoughts cannot be equated with their source. This habit is another bit of primal philosophy. If a man resists oblivion, meaning of course historical oblivion rather than Heidegger's extra-historical one of a history of being, if he resists the universally demanded sacrifice of a once-gained freedom of consciousness, he will not preach a restoration in the field of intellectual history. The fact that history has rolled over certain positions will be respected as a verdict on their truth content only by those who agree with Schiller that world history is the world tribunal. What has been cast aside but not absorbed theoretically will often yield its truth content only later. It festers as a sore on the prevailing health. This will lead back to it in changed situations. The remaining theoretical inadequacies in Hegel and Marx become part of historical practice and can thus be newly reflected upon in theory, instead of thought bowing irrationally to the primacy of practice. Practice itself was an eminently theoretical concept. This phrase, truth content, I want to pause on that for a moment. So the truth content of something, we've encountered that before in Marx, in Hegel. We had a version of it also in Kant. So the truth content of something is precisely the truth of something that appears to be its opposite. So so not just the truth of something, but the truth content of something. That particular phrase means that the result of something is the opposite of itself, and certainly the opposite of its apparent intention. So again, truth content means contradiction, which is very different from the way we normally think about truth. We usually think about truth as non-contradiction, the law of non-contradiction, Aristotle, right? Which is the law of the truth of being. Something cannot be true if it contradicts its own being. A concept cannot be true if it is in contradiction to being. Oh no, in fact it can. In fact it must be. So the truth can be in contradiction with being when that being is to be transformed. When the potential of that being is the transformation of that being. Alex.
So is it like with the Reformation, which was a fundamentalist attempt to return to the origins of Christianity, but eventually became the exact opposite of Luther's intentions?
Absolutely. It became an atheist secular society. Right. And how to explain the logic of that, so to speak, it can only be explained dialectically. It can only be explained through movement of contradiction. You know, like the radical restoration of Christianity was actually its complete eradication. Right? Whereas the medieval sort of makeshift theology that kept Christianity going in the Catholic Church, and that sort of eclectically added philosophically to itself to buttress itself, you know, theologically with like Platonism and Aristotelian stuff, you know, so-called pagan philosophy. And then the church fathers just said, oh, well, actually they were Christian. Yeah, yes, they lived before Jesus, but they were Christians before Christ, and so their philosophy is fine. It's not pagan philosophy, actually. It's Christian philosophy. Yeah, that's the ticket. Right? So Christianity perpetuated itself through that kind of eclectic admixture of what it was not itself, including syncretic practices, right? So it absorbed syncretic practices from folk religion. And then when Luther was like, oh, the corruption of the church, let's go back to the word of Jesus, the gospel, right? That ended up tearing Christianity down to its foundation. There's a guy who's running around. He is the son of one of the founders of Hamas, who like left the movement. He's a Palestinian, and who also, you know, reacted against the Islamic fundamentalism of Hamas, but really reacted against the politics of Hamas, but then, you know, also reacted against Islam. And so he converted to Christianity, and now lives in the United States, and he's in the media. He's a kind of, you know, very critical of the Palestinians, very critical of Hamas. And what he said that stuck with me was, he said, Christianity redeems humanity of religion. Meaning the message of Jesus is that we don't need religion anymore. And I was like, bingo, that's right. That's exactly what Jesus' message is, in fact. It did violate Jesus' message to erect a church in the Middle Ages. It did. It was the end of religion, because it was the Word made flesh, as Hegel invoked the Gospels. It was the end of religion. It just took a while for that to manifest itself, meaning it was already the end of religion, Jesus was the end of religion. It was the secularization of humanity. It was the Word made flesh. It was God coming down to earth. And that's the end of traditional religion. But only, it took them about 1,600 years for that finally to play out in bourgeois society. But like I said, the ex-Muslim fundamentalist, right, could see Christianity more clearly than the Christians themselves see it. Meaning, he understood Jesus forgives every one of their sins, which means you don't have to do this religious stuff anymore. Like, yes, you have to treat each other ethically, you do have to do that, but you don't need to do this religious stuff anymore. You don't need to do these sacred rites. You don't need to submit to God. Right? God has forgiven us, which means that he's not punishing us and he's not demanding our submission. Yes. Right? But how was that finally brought about? Through a radical fundamentalist movement. And the Protestants were crazy radical fundamentalists. They really were. They were extreme. They plunged Europe into over 100 years of war in which millions were killed. They're the OG fundamentalists. That's the ruse of reason, though. Right? That's now, is something similar at work in the working class's struggle for socialism? Yes. Yes, it is. Right? That's why we can't really know. We read Imaginative Excesses last night. We don't know what the result of this struggle is going to be. We only know the negative characterization of it, the working class abolishing itself. Okay, what's the actual concrete content of that? What is that actually going to look like? We don't know. We can't know. And inevitably, it's going to be contrary to whatever we think it might be. It's not going to be the AI singularity that sheds humanity like a snakeskin, nor is it going to be some fulfillment of humanism. It's not going to be a return to some kind of state of nature, natural man, noble savage, anarcho-primitivism either. And yet both of those do express something of the truth of what it will be. All right, restoration of Homo sapiens in its innocence. Complete eradication of humanity by artificial intelligence. It's going to be both and neither of those things. That's the imminent movement of society and capitalism towards antithetical, polar opposite implications, potentialities. And in the meantime, we're philosophizing it. So I mentioned reduction of human intelligence to the operation of a computer. That's analytic philosophy. And complete mysticism of being. Existentialist philosophy. Heidegger. All right, these do express, both of them, the imminent movement of capitalism. Right. The fact that philosophy has become these two polar opposite things, analytic and continental. And also it's unclear which is which, so when we look at the postmodernists, if you guys know anything about postmodernism, post-structuralism is a strong component of it. And structuralism, structural linguistics, structural anthropology, is also very peculiar. The idea that humans are just the signifying monkeys, to use a term from Henry Louis Gates Jr., an African-American literary scholar, the signifying monkey. All right. Right? Are we just a natural species that bears language, like a virus, like a computer virus, that bears culture as like a meme? Right? Are we just the signifying monkeys? Are we just the linguistically endowed apes? Structuralism? And then post-structuralism. Oh no, it might not just be a function of language and culture, cultural forms, cultural signifiers, linguistic operations. It might be something more thoroughly dark than that. Biopolitics, biopower, Foucault. Right? The will to power of life itself. A little Nietzscheanism. Alright, so this is what philosophy has become. It's also what theory has become. So, you know, I do keep regretting that we didn't have time to read the Robert Pippin piece. You can read it on your own. It's on critical theory. It's in that introduction, week 1, or class number 1 in the files folder of Canvas. His essay published in 2004 on the current state and future of critical theory, short history of non-being, in which he says, well, critical theory used to be understood as Hegelian, Marxist, Frankfurt School, but now it's become wide enough to include Heidegger and his influential army of epigones, the postmodernists. Right, theory. Well, again, from Adorno's perspective, what is theory? What's the persistence of theory? Even if theory is like a radically reduced kind of philosophy. It is an expression of suffering in capitalism. It is an expression, a symptom, a symptomatic expression of possibility beyond capitalism, however, in one-sided, obscure, antinomical ways. All right, so the history of philosophy in the capitalist era, the history of philosophy in the 20th century, can give us access to the fundamental contradiction of society and its historical possibilities. But only, according to Adorno, if we hold on to non-identity. Now, what is that? So this phrase non-identity. So, non-identity of theory and practice. Non-identity of theory and practice. Again, this is something that we'll talk about more on Thursday in our last class session. Non-identity of subject and object, that's another way of thinking about it. So the articulated identity of subject and object is split in reification, non-identity of subject and object. There's another phrase in Marxism, social being and consciousness, the dialectic of social being and consciousness, the non-identity of social being and consciousness. So I think that we looked at the capitalist contradiction chart, the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production, and that's laid out there, this contradiction of social being and consciousness. So objectively, our social being is industrial production. Subjectively, our consciousness is bourgeois, namely the rights of labor and fair exchange, which has almost nothing to do with industrial production processes. Only metaphorically and tenuously does it have any connection whatsoever. So, again, the non-identity of social being and consciousness, the non-identity of being and consciousness, of historical being and historical consciousness. So what does that mean? What does that look like? It's the non-identity of a historical moment with itself. So any given historical moment in capitalism, any present moment, any present in capitalism, is self-contradictory. It is non-identical with itself. That's, by the way, I realized in our discussion last night, we got into redemption, the concept of redemption, and I'm not sure that I completely fulfilled the point of that discussion. You know, I was trying to decode, but of course maybe larded on and further obscured the meaning of the term redemption. But I was trying to sort of explain, when we encountered this word in Adorno, what it might mean. Well, redemption is a function of the non-identity of history. So the past isn't just what happened, but also its unfulfilled potential, which is still present. So when we read from Adorno's Minima Moralia, the sore that festers on the prevailing health of the present, right? The past as a wound, as a painful reminder of an unfulfilled potential that still haunts the present, that still informs the present, that still is present, however in contradiction to what happened, so in contradiction to the present, a contradiction between the past and the present, a non-identity of past and present. So if history is the relation of the present to the past, what if that relation of the present to the past is contradictory? Because it is both what happened, and it is also what could have happened but did not happen. Again, the failure to change the world, the attempt to change the world that miscarried. Philosophy is a symptom of that. Philosophy is a past thing that we nonetheless are haunted by in the present. Right, so both Heidegger and analytic philosophy, and also postmodernism as a kind of anti-philosophy. So there's a kind of anti-philosophical character to Heidegger as well as to analytic philosophy. Certainly it's anti-philosophy if philosophy means Kant and Hegel. It certainly is an anti-philosophy. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche I mentioned when we read Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy. Schopenhauer in another way, but Kierkegaard and Nietzsche as the founders of existentialism in many respects, they could also be seen as anti-philosophers. So after Hegel, you have a lot of anti-philosophy, including in the 20th century. So what is this anti-philosophy? What is this attempt to get out from under the historical legacy of philosophy? What's the struggle to overcome philosophy? What does that mean? What does that express? Well, it expresses a real need. There is a need to abolish philosophy, as Korsch put it. But we can't without realizing it. And what does realizing it mean? Well, again, in Korsch's view, it means the revolution. It means fulfilling the potential transformation of capitalism beyond itself. Transforming bourgeois social relations from their contradiction and crisis in capitalism beyond themselves. That's the meaning of communism, even if communism expresses it only one-sidedly. So communism is the real movement of history. That's not a function of the future, that's a function of the present. Capitalism, the movement of capitalism, is communism because capitalism is constantly abolishing itself. So that's why communism is the real movement of history. In the realm of philosophy, that means that philosophy, ever since Hegel, has been a movement of self-abolition. Again, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, analytic philosophy, postmodernism, anti-philosophy. That's been the movement of philosophy. It's been moving through various forms of negating itself. It's been perpetuating itself through various forms of negating itself. What's the meaning of that? The meaning of that is that that negation can only be truly brought about through a fulfillment or realization. Right, so that's what Adorno, his piece, Why Still Philosophy? that we read for yesterday. Right. The meaning of that piece. Let me bring that up. Maybe we'll look at that for a moment. Let's see. I'm trying to catch us up from yesterday. To a question such as why still philosophy, the formulation of which I myself am responsible, although its dilettantish tone does not escape me, most people will already guess the answer. They will expect a train of thought that accumulates all kinds of difficulties and reservations in order to lead ultimately more or less cautiously to a nevertheless, and the affirmation of what at first had been rhetorically cast into doubt. This all too familiar circuit corresponds to a conformist and apologetic attitude that characterizes itself as positive and reckons in advance on consent. And indeed, perhaps nothing better can be expected from someone whose job it is to teach philosophy, Adorno himself, whose bourgeois existence depends on its continued survival, and who undermines his own immediate interests as soon as he contests it. All that notwithstanding, I have some right to raise the question for the simple reason that I am not at all sure of the answer. Anyone who defends a cause deemed obsolete and superfluous by the spirit of the age places himself in the most disadvantageous position. His arguments sound half-hearted. Yes, but, consider, however, he says, as though trying to talk his audience into something they don't want. Anyone who doesn't want to be dissuaded from philosophy must take this misfortune into account. He must know that philosophy is no longer applicable to the techniques for mastering one's life, techniques in both the literal and figurative senses, with which philosophy was once so closely entwined, the good life. And philosophy no longer offers a medium of self-cultivation beyond these techniques, as was the case during the era of Hegel, when for a few short decades the very small class of German intellectuals communicated in their collective philosophical language. That's German idealism. Roughly since the death of Kant, philosophy has made itself suspect because of its disparity with the positive sciences, especially the natural sciences. And it was the first discipline in public awareness to succumb to the crisis of the humanistic concept of culture, otherwise known as the bourgeois concept of culture, about which I need not say a great deal. The Kantian and Hegelian revivals, whose titles alone already reveal the feebleness of their programs, have not changed the situation much. Finally, in the general tendency towards specialization, philosophy too has established itself as a specialized discipline, one purified of all specific content. In so doing, philosophy has denied its own constitutive concept, the intellectual freedom that does not obey the dictates of specialized knowledge. At the same time, by abstaining from all definite content, whether as a formal logic and theory of science, or as the legend of being beyond all beings, so that's analytic and Heideggerian continental philosophy, philosophy declared its bankruptcy regarding concrete societal goals. To be sure, philosophy thereby merely ratified a process that is largely tantamount to its own history. More and more fields were snatched away from it and transformed into science. It scarcely had any other choice but to become either a science itself or a minuscule tolerated enclave, which as such already conflicts with what it wants to be, namely a non-particularized pursuit. Newtonian physics was still called philosophy. Modern scientific consciousness would see in this an archaic relic, a vestige of that earlier epoch of Greek speculation, when sound explanation of nature and sublime metaphysics were still inseparably interwoven in the name of the essence of things. This is why some resolute beings have proclaimed that such archaic themes constitute the only philosophy, and have tried to restore them. But the consciousness suffering from the fissured state of the world and conjuring up a past unity out of its own deprivation contradicts the very content it aspires to win for itself. Therefore, it must autocratically promote its own primordial language. Restoration is as futile in philosophy as it is anywhere else. Philosophy has to protect itself from the chatter of culture and the abracadabra of worldviews. It also should not imagine that specialized work in epistemological theory, or whatever else prides itself on being research, is actually philosophy. Yet a philosophy forswearing all that must in the end be irreconcilably at odds with the dominant consciousness. Nothing else raises it above the suspicion of apologetics. Philosophy that satisfies its own intention and does not childishly skip behind its own history and the real one has its lifeblood in the resistance against the common practices of today and what they serve, against the justification of what happens to be the case. Okay, so basically what he's upholding there is critical philosophy. In other words, the point of philosophy is for it to have a critical value. And it's been critical from the beginning, we could say. It's been critical from the time of Kant and Hegel. That's the birth of critical philosophy, again, as Robert Pickman talks about in his piece. But you could even say that philosophy itself, its origins, its clear origins as separate from science and separate from art, separate from poetry, and separate from theology, separate from religion. Its clear origins are with Socrates, with Plato and Aristotle. In other words, the Socratic dialectic, which is also meant to be critical, if only critical of thinking, but nonetheless critical. And of course, it was understood to be critical of its own society, the doxa, the received wisdom, the common sense, and therefore of society itself. Philosophy should not, with foolish arrogance, set about collecting information and then take a position. Rather, it must unrestrictedly, without recourse to some mental refuge, experience. It must do exactly what is avoided by those who refuse to forsake the maxim that every philosophy must finally produce something positive. Rimbaud's "I am absolutely modern," or one must be, I should say, one must be absolutely modern, is neither an aesthetic program nor a program for aesthetes. It is a categorical imperative of philosophy. Whatever wants nothing to do with the trajectory of history belongs all the more truly to it. History promises no salvation and offers the possibility of hope only to the concept whose movement follows history's path to the very extreme. Okay, so what the hell is that? What does that mean? Well, he's pointing out in the body of the essay how Heidegger and analytic philosophy, or logical positivism in the way of characterizing analytic philosophy, they both make the same move. They both do the same thing, which is to try to extricate philosophy from history, as opposed to what the bourgeois philosophers understood. So Hegel put it very pithily, philosophy is its own time comprehended in thought, meaning the very substance of philosophy is historical. In capitalism, the only way to rescue philosophy has been to try to divorce it from history, to try to return to a kind of ahistorical prima philosophia, kind of first philosophy of eternal principles and values. Right, so that is the abandonment of critical philosophy if critical philosophy is about its own time. And yet, where does that divorce from history come from? Why do these opposed antithetical poles of 20th century philosophy, analytic and Heideggerian, quote-unquote, continental, why do they want to extricate philosophy from history? And isn't that move itself a critical move? Right? It's in opposition to the actual movement of society and history. They both, whether consciously or not, self-consciously or not, are objecting to capitalism. by trying to purify thought of everything temporal and historical. Right? When the imminent movement of history is destructive and oppressive, then of course thinking might try to save itself by escaping from history in however antithetical ways. Again, the being that persists despite all historical change, or the logic that stands outside of history. Before we take a break, I wanted to just mention something, namely relativism. So he has a section against relativism. That's one of the sections of his Negative Dialectics. Let's see if we had it in our list. I think that it is. Where is it? Oh, it might not be one of the sections that we read. But in any case, he does have a section of Negative Dialectics called Against Relativism. If I'm not mistaken, might be translated differently. So, how does this not be this thorough historical view? Oh yeah, it is against relativism. I thought so. All right. Oh yeah, this is outside the selection of readings that we had. It's in part 1. Well, it sounds like historicizing makes things relativistic. Well, no, because history can't be undone. In other words, relativism would mean that there's no anchor. Right? Relativism would mean that the standpoint is arbitrary. No, adopting this radically historical view of things does not introduce relativism, but actually introduces a firm basis, a firm anchor for things. History can't be undone. All right, so grounding or basing one's perspective in history and in historical transformation and change, and in the necessity of that change, the necessity as well as the possibility and potentiality of that change, doesn't turn everything into an arbitrary standpoint. So absolutism and relativism are both wrong because both leave out history. An absolutist standpoint, as opposed to a relativist standpoint, stands outside of history, and a relativist standpoint also stands outside of history because it treats history as just a random succession of events, one damn thing after another, as opposed to a necessary unfolding process, however pathological and however involving a great deal of reversals, ironies, the ruse of reason, contradiction. So the danger is identity thinking, namely there would be identity thinking in absolutism, there would be identity thinking in relativism, because whether a perspective is absolute or relative, it would be identical with itself. And there can be identity thinking in historicism as well, that can identify consciousness and historical being. So the movement of history being contradictory, the movement of historical necessity being contradictory, creates a paradox or a conundrum. Because if you say, okay, the thought of one's own time, that's what philosophy is, that doesn't preclude the fact that one's own time is contradictory, and therefore the thought or the philosophy of one's time is also contradictory. It also doesn't foreclose change, an openness, a possibility of transformation. Indeed, it necessitates it. That recognition of contradiction. Right, so again, it's a false choice, absolutism and relativism. Historicism and an ahistorical perspective. These are false choices whose appearance, those antinomies in appearance, has to be understood. What are people trying to do when they reach for relativism, or when they reach for absolutism, when they reach for historicism, or when they reach for something ahistorical? Well, they're always reaching for what Adorno calls identity thinking. Right? So they're looking for some sure grounding, so grounding thinking, basing thinking, either in social reality or basing thinking in thought itself. But he's saying, actually, the only sure foundation of thinking is contradiction, is the non-identity of the thought and its moment, its social historical moment. It's a peculiar way of thinking about how to surely ground and base things, but this is what Adorno is doing. All right, let's take a short break and then we'll come back and continue our discussion of negative dialectics. Okay, let's resume. Okay, so let's pick up actually where we just were. Let me go back to this question of identity. So the section after the relation to left-wing egalianism. All right, let's see. Okay. All right, I'll share my screen with you guys. On the dialectics of identity. As the thinker immerses himself in what faces him to begin with, in the concept, and as he perceives its imminently antinomical character, So that means that from within itself it yields two opposed laws. That's what antinomy means. He clings to the idea of something beyond contradiction. The antithesis of thought to whatever is heterogeneous to thought is reproduced in thought itself as its immanent contradiction. Reciprocal criticism of the universal and of the particular, identifying acts of judgment, whether the concept does justice to what it covers, and whether the particular fulfills its concept. These constitute the medium of thinking about the non-identity of particular and concept, and not of thinking only. If mankind is to get rid of the coercion to which the form of identification really subjects it, it must attain identity with its concept at the same time. In this, all relevant categories play a part. The exchange principle, so here it's unfortunately mistranslated as barter, so when you encounter this word barter in the E.B. Ashton translation of Negative Dialectics, it's really exchange. The exchange principle, the reduction of human labor to the abstract universal concept of average working hours, or socially necessary labor time, is fundamentally akin to the principle of identification. Exchange is the social model of the principle, and without the principle there would be no exchange. It is through exchange that non-identical individuals and performances become commensurable and identical. So this should remind us of the chart of terms that I have on the commodity form, that use value and exchange value, being combined in the commodity form of the value of labor, the value of human activity in society. The spread of the principle imposes on the whole world an obligation to become identical, to become total. But if we denied the principle abstractly, if we proclaimed, to the greater glory of the irreducibly qualitative, that parity should no longer be the ideal rule, we would be creating excuses for recidivism into ancient injustice. From olden times, the main characteristic of the exchange of equivalents has been that unequal things would be exchanged in its name, that the surplus value of labor would be appropriated. If comparability as a category of measure if comparability as a category of measure were simply annulled, the rationality which is inherent in the exchange principle, as ideology of course, but also as promise, would give way to direct appropriation, to force, and nowadays to the naked privilege of monopolies and cliques. When we criticize the exchange principle as the identifying principle of thought, we want to realize the ideal of free and just exchange. To date, this ideal is only a pretext. Its realization alone would transcend exchange. Once critical theory has shown it up for what it is, an exchange of things that are equal and yet unequal, our critique of the inequality within equality aims at equality too. For all our skepticism of the rancor involved in the bourgeois egalitarian ideal that tolerates no qualitative difference. If no man had part of his labor withheld from him anymore, rational identity would be a fact, and society would have transcended the identifying mode of thinking. This comes close enough to Hegel. The dividing line from him is scarcely drawn by individual distinctions. It is drawn rather by our intent, whether in our consciousness, theoretically, and in the resulting practice, we maintain that identity is the ultimate, that it is the absolute, that we want to reinforce it, or whether we feel that identity is the universal coercive mechanism that we too finally need to free ourselves from universal coercion, just as freedom can come to be real only through coercive civilization, not by way of any back to nature. So recall Rousseau, society forces us to be free. Totality, is to be opposed by convicting it of non-identity with itself, of the non-identity it denies, according to its own concept. Negative dialectics is thus tied to the supreme categories of identitarian philosophy as its point of departure. Thus, too, it remains something false, according to identitarian logic. It remains the thing against which it is conceived. It must correct itself in its critical course, a course affecting concepts which in negative dialectics are formally treated as if they come first, for it too. It is one thing for our thought to close itself under compulsion of the form which nothing can escape from, to comply in principle, so as imminently to deny the conclusive structure claimed by traditional philosophy. And it is quite another thing for thought to urge that conclusive form on its own, with the intent of making itself the first. In idealism, the highly formal identity principle had, due to its formalization, an affirmative substance. This is innocently brought to light by terminology, when simple predicative sentences are called affirmative. The copula says it is so and not otherwise. The act of synthesis for which the copula stands indicates that it shall not be otherwise, else the act would not be performed. The will to identity works in each synthesis. As an a priori task of thought, a task immanent in thought, identity seems positive and desirable. The substrate of the synthesis is thus held to be reconciled with the I, and therefore to be good, which promptly permits the moral desideratum that the subject, understanding how much the cause is its own, should bow to what is heterogeneous to it. Identity is the primal form of ideology. We relish it as adequacy to the thing it suppresses. Adequacy has always been subjection to dominant purposes, and in that sense, its own contradiction. After the unspeakable effort it must have cost our species to produce the primacy of identity even against itself, man rejoices and basks in his conquest by turning it into the definition of the conquered thing. What has happened to it must be presented by the thing as it's in itself. Ideology's power of resistance to enlightenment is owed to its complicity with identifying thought, or indeed with thought at large. The ideological side of thinking shows in its permanent failure to make good on the claim that the non-I is finally the I. The more the I thinks, the more perfectly will it find itself debased into an object. Identity becomes the authority for a doctrine of adjustment, in which the object, which the subject is supposed to go by, repays the subject for what the subject has done to it. The subject is to see reason against its reason. The critique of ideology is thus not something peripheral and intra-scientific, not something limited to the objective mind and to the products of the subjective mind. Philosophically, it is central. It is a critique of the constitutive consciousness itself. So unpacking that a little bit, it's a little bit tricky. Some of these formulations are inherently ambiguous. Critique of the constitutive consciousness itself. So constitutive consciousness, that means the consciousness that constitutes things as they are, but it also means the consciousness that is constituted by things as they are. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead. Actually going to jump ahead a little bit. We're going to skip some of the sections that we had for our reading. Let's look at objectivity and reification, perhaps. Let's see. Oops, I went past where I wanted to go. I think. Okay, 189 to 192. Hold on. All right. Actually, the next section will be freedom in organized society. Let's look at freedom in organized society, just in the interest of time. Okay, without any thought of freedom, theoretical reasons for an organized society would be hard to find. Society, in its turn, will then curtail freedom. Both might be shown in Hobbes's construction of the social contract. Unlike Hobbes, the determinist, a factually consistent determinism would sanction the war of all against all. If all men were equally predetermined and blind, every criterion of actions would fall by the wayside. The perspective of an extremity is unveiled. Whether the demand for freedom, put forth so that men can live together, does not contain a paralogism, that freedom must be a reality lest there be horror. In fact, there is horror because there is no freedom yet. Reflection on the question of free will does not abolish the question, but turns it into one for the philosophy of history. Why have the two theses, the will is free and the will is unfree, become an antinomy? The historical origin of that reflection did not escape Kant, who expressly based the revolutionary claim of his own ethics on the delay in the reflection. Quote, "Man was seen to be bound to laws by his duty, but it occurred to no one that the only legislation to which man is subject is his own, and yet universal, and that his only obligation is to act in line with a will that is his own, but is also universally law-giving according to the ends of nature." By no means, however, did it occur to Kant whether freedom itself, to him an eternal idea, might not be essentially historic, and that not just as a concept, but in its empirical substance. Whole epochs, whole societies, lacked not only the concept of freedom, but the thing. To attribute the thing to them as an objective noumenon, even though totally hidden from the people concerned, would conflict with the Kantian transcendental principle, with the principle that is said to be founded in the subjective consciousness, and would be untenable as the supposed consciousness at large if it were wholly lacking in any living person. Hence, probably, Kant's stubborn endeavor to demonstrate the moral sense as something that exists everywhere, even in the radically wicked. Otherwise, he would have had to say that phases and societies in which there is no freedom are not only not rational, but not human. And the adherent of Rousseau would scarcely have stooped to saying that. Before the formation of the individual in the modern sense, which to Kant was a matter of course, in the sense meaning not simply the biological human being, but the one constituted as a unit by its own self-reflection, the Hegelian self-consciousness, it is an anachronism to talk of freedom before this time, whether as a reality or as a challenge, as a task. Likewise, freedom, without which impairment can only be achieved under social conditions of unfettering plenty, might be wholly extinguished again, perhaps without leaving a trace. The trouble is not that free men do radical evil, as evil is being done beyond all measure conceivable to Kant. The trouble is that as yet there is no world in which, there are flashes of this in Brecht's work, men would no longer need to be evil. Evil, therefore, is the world's own unfreedom. Whatever evil is done comes from the world. Society destines the individuals to be what they are, even by their imminent genesis. Their freedom or unfreedom is not primary, as it would seem under the spell of the principium individuationists. For the ego, as Schopenhauer explained by the myth of Maya's veil, makes even the insight into its dependence difficult to gain for the subjective consciousness. The principle of individualization, the law of particularity to which the universal reason in the individuals is tied, tends to insulate them from encompassing contexts and thereby strengthens their flattering confidence in the subject's autarky. Under the name of freedom, their totality is contrasted with the totality of whatever restricts individuality. Yet the principium individuationis is by no means the metaphysically ultimate and unalterable, and thus it is not freedom either. Freedom is a moment, rather in a twofold sense. It is entwined, not to be isolated, and for the time being, it is never more than an instant of spontaneity, a historical node, the road to which is blocked under present conditions. The individual's independence, inappropriately stressed by liberal ideology, does not prevail, nor is there any denying his extremely real separation from society, which that ideology misinterprets. At times, the individual would oppose himself to society as an independent being, though a particular one, a being capable of rationally pursuing its own interest. In that phase, and beyond it, the question of freedom was the genuine question, whether society permits the individual to be as free as it promises. And thus it was also the question whether society itself is as free as it promises. Temporarily, the individual looms above the blind social context, but in his windowless isolation he only helps so much more to reproduce that context. No less indicative of the historic experience that inside and outside are unreconciled is the thesis of unfreedom. Men are unfree because they are beholden to externality, and this externality in turn consists also of men themselves. As perceived in Hegel's phenomenology, it is only from that which has been divided from it, from that which is necessarily against it, that the subject acquires the concepts of freedom and unfreedom, which it will then relate to its own monadological structure. So that's the structure of a monad. Monad means a kind of singularity, as opposed to a dyad or a triad. The pre-philosophical consciousness is located this side of the alternative, to a subject that acts naively and opposes itself to its environment. Its own conditioning is non-transparent, or opaque, we could say. To dominate this conditioning, consciousness must render it transparent. The thought, by means of its freedom, turns back to itself as to its subject, and its sovereignty also leads to the concept of unfreedom. The two concepts are not a simple antithesis, they are interwoven. No theoretical curiosity can make us aware of this. It is the nature-controlling sovereignty in its social form, dominion over people, that suggests the opposite to our consciousness, the idea of freedom. Its historical archetype was he who is topmost in hierarchies, the man who is not visibly dependent. So recall here that nature doesn't just mean physical or biological nature, it means also historical and cultural nature. It means everything that exists. It means everything that has come into existence historically. Keep that in mind. In the abstract universal concept of things beyond nature, freedom is spiritualized into freedom from the realm of causality. With that, however, it becomes a self-deception. Psychologically speaking, the subject's interest in the thesis that it is free would be narcissistic, as immoderate as anything of the kind. There is narcissism even in Kant's arguments, for all his categorical localization of freedom in a sphere above psychology. According to his groundwork for a metaphysics of morals, for example, including the most arrant knave, need only be shown examples of honest intent, of constancy in following good maxims, of compassion and of goodwill, to wish that he too were so minded. He can expect no gratification of desires from this, no condition that would satisfy any of his real or otherwise conceivable inclinations, but only a greater inner worth of his person. But he believes that he is this better person when he puts himself on the standpoint of a member of the intelligible world, a move he is involuntarily compelled to make by the idea of freedom, i.e., independence of determining causes from the sensible world. There is no effort Kant will not make to prove that this expectation of an enhanced interpersonal worth, the supposed motivation behind the thesis of freedom, rests in turn upon the moral law, on the very objectivity to which, on the other hand, consciousness is said to rise only on grounds of that expectation. And yet he cannot make us forget that in our view of freedom, the practical use of common human reason is coupled with the need for self-exaltation with the person's worth. That immediate consciousness, the common moral cognition of reason, which is the methodical starting point of Kant's groundwork, will find itself no less interested in denying the same freedom which it claims. The more freedom the subject and the community of subjects ascribes to itself, the greater its responsibility. And before this responsibility must fail in a bourgeois life, which in practice has never yet endowed a subject with the unabridged autonomy accorded to it in theory. Hence the subject must feel guilty. What makes the subjects aware of the bounds of their freedom is that they are part of nature, and finally that they are powerless against society, which has become independent of them. Yet the universality of the concept of freedom, a concept shared by the oppressed as well, recoils against dominion as freedom's model. Reacting to this recoil, those who have the privilege of freedom delight in finding others not yet ripe for freedom. They rationalize this persuasively by way of natural causality. The subjects are not only fused with their own physical nature, a consistent legality holds sway also in the psychological realm, which reflection has laboriously divided from the world of bodies. This feeling rose proportionally with the soul's definition as a unit, but a sense of unfreedom exists no more than does an immediately evident sense of freedom. It always requires either that socially perceived phenomena be reflected back upon the subject. The oldest instance is the so-called Platonic psychology, or that objectifications be performed by psychological science, in whose hands its discovery, the life of the soul, becomes a thing among things and falls under the causality predicated by the world of things. Okay, so again, what he's working through there, the antinomies he's working through there via Kant, are the experience of freedom and unfreedom. The desire to be free as also the basis of the recognition of unfreedom. So he's critiquing Kant on the one hand, but he's also saying it's only in our desire to be free that we would recognize our unfreedom. And so he's also rehabilitating or redeeming Kant, you could say. The reason he's bringing in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, this is the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative in Kant, this is Kant's famous moral philosophy, is that everyone should act according to a principle that, if made universal, would be good. So if everyone acted the same way, according to the same principle, so not necessarily the same empirical, practical action, but according to the same principle, then the result would be good. That's the first of the two dimensions of the categorical imperative. The second dimension of it is that one should treat others and also treat oneself not only as a means, but as an end in itself. So the idea is that we can't help but use each other, and we also can't help but use ourselves. But we should also treat both ourselves and others as ends in themselves and not merely as means. Right, so those are the two dimensions of the categorical imperative. And he thinks that those principles, however abstract, are fundamental. That's why it's a groundwork. That's why it's a categorical imperative. Are fundamental to autonomy, or self-rule, or freedom, right? Self-determination, freedom. And he thinks that that's true both for the individual and for the social collective. So that's why he's invoking the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, because Adorno is saying that, okay, this society still operates on that principle. I once had a colleague tell me that the categorical imperative of Kant was utopian. It's not utopian, it's actually what we do all the time. It's the principles by which we act all the time. When we are acting morally, of course we don't always act morally, but when we do act morally, we act according to these principles. It's only capitalism that makes them seem utopian. In other words, it's only capitalism that seems to compromise our ability to maintain these principles, to act morally. Right, so they're not utopian principles at all. They are actually informing. I think that I might have mentioned that Kant saw himself, his revolution in his thought after he read Rousseau. He recognized that as a formal philosopher with a kind of specialized talent and skill, he nonetheless was no more intelligent than the common day laborer. And also, reading Rousseau, he realized that the task of philosophy, the purpose of philosophy, was to explain common sense. Right, so it would not have occurred to Kant, in some ways also not to Hegel, although maybe Hegel could conceive of it. It didn't quite occur to Kant, at least not in his formal philosophy, that we could end up in the situation that we're in capitalism, where we do act according to this bourgeois moral categorical imperative. Those are our fundamental moral principles. We try, and yet we always have to violate them. And indeed, acting that way does not produce a good outcome in a universal sense. It does not. Again, the passage from Hegel that we read about the grief, the suffering that the world comes to, being brought about by our good intentions, not by our bad intentions, but precisely by our good intentions. That the worst suffering of the world is produced by our good intentions rather than our bad intentions. Right, looked at historically. So again, Hegel might be able to conceive of this in a way that's a little bit different from Kant. And that the principle itself would be violated. In other words, that it wouldn't be just a failure to realize the principle, but that it would be objectively impossible to realize the principle in capitalism. All right, that's the paradox. Or that's the antinomy. That's what the will is free, the will is not free amounts to. It amounts to autonomy and heteronomy. Are we capable of self-rule, of autonomy, self-determination? Or are we not? Are we always ruled by another, including by, he mentions bodies, that our subjective will, that our psychology, is ruled by the will of our physical self, our bodies. Right? That would also be another example of heteronomy, of rule by another. It doesn't have to be by another being. It could be ruled inescapably by another aspect of ourselves. Alex?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something also to that. In Adam Smith's vision of society, Invisible Hand, people are rational, but they're self-interested. So they are after certain ends. And I think also one very interesting moment in Kant is that he calls it hypothetical imperative. Like it's a rational mind, all right, but it's hypothetical imperative. But there is rational action only for the sake of rational action, which is categorical imperative. So he also, in a way, as you say, autonomy liberates, emancipates a bourgeois individual outside of any sort of compulsion, even compulsion of just acting in their own interest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, the trick there is, again, for Kant, it's sort of dialectical between, like, two interests, like reasoning like a cog in the machine, private reason, and public reason, reasoning like a scholar. Right? So one can, according to Kant, recognize that one is dually motivated or contradictorily motivated, that one has conflicting interests, that one has sort of baser interests as well as higher interests. Right? But that's a little different from this kind of total schism in capitalism, right? Or at least Adorno thinks so. So it's not that the Kantian framework is wholly different or alien from capitalism. It isn't. And yet there is a difference that can be registered. Right, so again, even the experience of unfreedom is a moment in freedom. The problem is, do we even have that experience of unfreedom? In other words, do we have the experience of that contradiction? Or do we... What he goes on to in the following section is... he brings in a bit of Freud, which we haven't dealt with in the course. And so we're not going to examine that closely. But that it must be denied and rendered unconscious. You know, that we might see the key to our freedom, so to speak, in the denial of our ego. Right, in a kind of self-abnegation. Right, but that moves more into a psychological realm. Right, and like I said, we haven't dealt with Freud here, and so I won't get into that. But just know that it's there, because he sees that the kind of Freudian psychoanalytic attribution of repression to the unconscious, that is also something specific to capitalism. In other words, that is something specific to the way this heteronomy functions. Meaning that would also not necessarily have been the case psychologically for people throughout history. But that it is the case in capitalism needs to be understood as a symptom, as a phenomenon of capitalism itself. I'm going to move on to self-experience of freedom and unfreedom. Okay. Oops, I've had the page numbers correct here on the syllabus. Oh, because I'm looking at the wrong part. Okay. 258, 262. Oh, it's 260, all right. Okay. I'll share my screen with you guys. So it's beginning on page 261. The contradiction dates back to the objective contradiction between the experience which consciousness has of itself and its relation to the totality. The individual feels free insofar as he has opposed himself to society and can do something, though incomparably less than he believes, against society and other individuals. His freedom is primarily that of a man pursuing his own ends, ends that are not directly and totally exhausted by social ends. In this sense, freedom coincides with the principle of individuation. A freedom of this type has broken loose from primitive society. Within an increasingly rational one, it has achieved a measure of reality. At the same time, in the midst of bourgeois society, freedom remains no less delusive than individuality itself. A critique of free will, as well as of determinism, means a critique of this delusion. The law of value comes into play over the heads of formerly free individuals. They are unfree, according to Marx's insight, as the involuntary executors of that law. The more thoroughly unfree, the more rank the growth of the social antagonisms it took to form the very concept of freedom. The process of evolving individual independence is a function of the exchange society and terminates in the individual's abolition by integration. What produced freedom will recoil in unfreedom. The individual was free as an economically active bourgeois subject, free to the extent to which the economic system required him to be autonomous in order to function. His autonomy is thus potentially negated at the source. The freedom of which he boasted had a negative side, which Hegel was the first to notice. It was a mockery of true freedom, an expression of the contingency of every individual's social fate. The real necessity involved in the kind of freedom praised by ultra-liberal ideology, in a freedom which the free had to maintain and to enforce with their elbows. This necessity was an image designed to cover up the total social necessity that compels an individual to be rugged if he wants to survive. Thus, even concepts abstract enough to seem to approach invariance prove to be historic. An example is the concept of life. While life keeps reproducing itself under the prevailing conditions of unfreedom, its concept, by its own meaning, presupposes the possibility of things not yet included, of things yet to be experienced. And this possibility has been so far reduced that the word life sounds by now like an empty consolation. But just as the freedom of the bourgeois individual is a caricature, so is the necessity of his actions. It is not the transparent necessity called for by the concept of law. It strikes every individual subject as an accident rather, as a sequel to the mythical fate. Life has retained this negativity, an aspect that furnished the title of Schubert's piano piece for four hands, The Storms of Life. The anarchy in the production of goods is the manifestation of the social primitivity that vibrates in the word life, in the use of a biological category for a thing that is social in essence. If the social process of production and reproduction were transparent for the subjects, if the subjects determined that process, they would no longer be passively buffeted by the ominous storms of life. The so-called life would vanish then, and so would the fatal aura with which the fin de siècle surrounded that word in the industrial age, that's the end of the century, to justify its wretched irrationality. What he's making reference to there is both the aesthetic and the philosophy of vitalism and of a kind of Art Nouveau of the Belle Epoque at the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s. So that's what fin de siècle means. The transiency of that surrogate occasionally casts its friendly shadows ahead. 19th century novels about adultery are already waste paper. If we accept the greatest products of that epoch, the ones that evoke its historic archetypes. Nor would a producer now dare to stage Abe Habel's Giges for an audience whose ladies will not give up their bikinis. There is a touch of barbarism in this fear of anachronistic subject matter, this lack of aesthetic distance. And one day, if mankind does work its way out, the same fate will overtake everything that is today still viewed as life and merely fools us about how little life there is. Until that time, the prevailing legality, or law, runs counter to the individual and his interests. So what he means by that is more like a structural law, a structural principle, not like the law in the books. Under the conditions of a bourgeois economy, this is an unshakable fact. In such an economy, there can be no answer to the question whether freedom or unfreedom of the will exists, and that economy, in turn, is a plaster cast of bourgeois society. The category of the individual, in truth a historical category, deceptively exempts the question of free will from social dynamics and treats each individual as an original phenomenon. In keeping with the ideology of individualist society, freedom has been poorly internalized. This bars any cogent reply to the ideology. If the thesis of free will burdens the dependent individuals with the social injustice that they can do nothing about, if it ceaselessly humiliates them with desiderata they cannot fulfill, if the thesis of unfreedom, on the other hand, amounts to a metaphysically extended rule of the status quo, this thesis proclaims itself immutable. And if the individual is not prepared to cower anyway, it invites him to cower because that is all he can do. Determinism acts as if dehumanization, the totally unfolded commodity character of the working capacity of labor power. So determinism acts as if dehumanization, the totally unfolded commodity form of labor power, were human nature pure and simple. No thought is given to the fact that there is a limit to the commodity character, the labor power that has not just an exchange value, but a use value. To deny free will outright means to reduce men unreservedly to the normal commodity form of their labor in full-fledged capitalism. Equally wrong is a prioristic determinism, the doctrine of free will, which in the middle of the commodity society would abstract from that society. The individual himself forms a moment of the commodity society. The pure spontaneity that is attributed to him is the spontaneity which society expropriates. All that the subject needs to do to be lost is to pose an inescapable alternative. The will is free or it is unfree. Each drastic thesis is false. In their innermost core, the theses of determinism and freedom coincide. Both proclaim identity. The reduction of pure spontaneity applies to the empirical subjects, the very same law which as an expanded causal category becomes determinism. Perhaps free men would be freed from the will also. Surely it is only in a free society that individuals would be free. Along with outward repression, the inner repression would also disappear, probably after long periods of time and with recidivism permanently threatening. Where traditional philosophy, acting in a spirit of repression, used to confound freedom and responsibility, responsibility would now turn into every individual's fearless, active participation in a world that would no longer institutionalize the parts played, but would allow them to have consequences in reality. The antinomy between the determination of the individual and the social responsibility that contradicts this determination is not due to a misuse of concepts. It is a reality, the moral indication that the universal and the particular are unreconciled. According to every psychological insight, even Hitler and his monsters were slaves to their early childhood, products of mental mutilation. And yet, the few one managed to catch must not be acquitted lest the crime, justified to the unconscious of the masses by the failure of lightning to strike from heaven, be repeated ad infinitum. This is something not to be glossed over with artificial constructions, such as utilitarian necessity at odds with reason. Humanity comes to the individual only when the entire sphere of individuation, its moral aspect included, is seen through as an epiphenomenon. At times, it is society as a whole, which in despair about its situation stands for freedom, against the individuals, and for the freedom promised in a note which the unfreedom of the individual dishonors. On the other hand, in this age of universal social repression, the picture of freedom against society lives in the crushed, abused individual's features alone. Where that freedom will hide out at any moment in history cannot be decreed once and for all. Freedom turns concrete in the changing forms of repression, as resistance to repression. There has been as much free will as there were men with the will to be free. But freedom itself and unfreedom are so entangled that unfreedom is not just an impediment to freedom, but a premise of its concept. This can no more be called out as an absolute than any other single concept. Without the unity and the compulsion of reason, nothing similar to freedom would ever have to come to mind, much less into being. This is documented in philosophy. There is no available model of freedom save one, that consciousness, as it intervenes in the total social constitution, will through that constitution intervene in the complexion of the individual. This notion is not utterly chimerical, because consciousness is a ramification of the energy of drives. It is part impulse itself, and also a moment of that which it intervenes in. If there were not that affinity which Kant so furiously denies, neither would there be the idea of freedom, for whose sake he denies the affinity. So that's the affinity of impulse and will. All right, let's we'll look at the final section that we had from Negative Dialectics from page 300. Alright, this is Tendency and Facts, an excursus on Hegel, World Spirit, and Natural History. This will be the last thing that we look at tonight. Most sensitively resisted by human common sense, by the sound mind whose soundness is what ails it, is the preponderance of anything objective over the individuals, in their consciousness as well as in their coexistence. The preponderance can be experienced crassly day after day. One represses it as an unfounded speculation, so the individuals may continue to flatter themselves that their standardized notions are twice unconditioned truths, so their delusions may be preserved from the suspicion of not being so, and of their lives being doomed. Ours is an epoch that has been as relieved to shed the system of objective idealism, that's Hegel's philosophy, as to discard the economic doctrine of objective values. And the theorems that are particularly topical in such an epoch are the ones said to be of no use to a spirit that seeks its own security and the security of cognition in the extant, in the existing, in social institutions as the well-organized sums of immediate individual facts, or in the subjective character of their members. The objective and ultimately absolute Hegelian spirit, the Marxist law of value that comes into force without men being conscious of it. To an unleashed experience, these are more evident than the prepared facts of a positivistic scientific bustle, which today extends to the native pre-scientific consciousness. Only to the greater glory of objective cognition, that activity breaks men of the habit of experiencing the real objectivity to which they are subjected in themselves as well. If thinking people were capable of such experience and prepared for it, it would have to undermine their belief in facticity itself. It would have to make them go so far beyond the facts that the facts would lose their unreflected primacy over the universals, which triumphant nominalism holds for nothing, for a subtractable adjunct tacked on by the classifying scientist. There is a line in the initial deliberation of Hegel's logic, to the effect that nothing in the world is not as mediated as it is immediate. So this is something that Lukacs also brought up in the phenomenon of reification. That what appears to be most immediate is actually the most mediated. A little bit of a clunky translation here. And nowhere does this line endure more precisely than in the facts, of which historiography is so proud. Of course, when the Gestapo knocks on a dissenter's door at 6 a.m. under Hitlerite fascism, it would be foolish to use epistemological refinements to deny that the individual to whom this happens is more directly affected than by the preceding power plays and by the installation of the party machine in every branch of administration, let alone by the historical trend that shattered the continuity of the Weimar Republic, and does not show in any context other than in a conceptual one, and not compulsorily except in theoretical unfoldment. And yet the brute fact of the government onslaught which fascism looses on the individual does depend on all these moments, however remote and currently irrelevant they may be to the victim. It would take the most wretched nitpicking garbed as scientific acribia to blind us to the fact that the French Revolution, for all the abrupt concurrence of some of its acts, fitted into the overall course of bourgeois emancipation. That revolution would have been neither possible nor successful if in 1789 the key positions of economic production had not been already occupied by the bourgeoisie, if it had not already topped the absolutist crest of a feudalism that coalesced at times with the bourgeois interest. Something that Adam Smith discussed in our readings about the alliance between the absolute monarch and the bourgeoisie against the church and feudal aristocracy. Nietzsche's scandalizing imperative, what's falling ought to be pushed, serves ex post facto to codify an arch-bourgeois maxim. Probably all bourgeois revolutions were decided in advance by the historic upsurge of the respective class. An admixture of ostentation was then externalized in art as classicistic decor. So, David's painting The Oath of the Horatii. Even so, at the point of historic fracture, that trait would have scarcely been realized without the acute absolutist mismanagement and the financial crisis on which the physiocratic reformers foundered under Louis XVI. The specific privations of the masses of Paris, at least, presumably set off the movement, while in other countries, where the need was not so acute, the bourgeois emancipation process succeeded without a revolution, and left the more or less absolutist form of government initially untouched. In Germany, for example. One advantage of the infantile distinction of deeper cause and outward occasion is that it crudely registers the dualism of immediacy and mediation. The occasions are immediate. The so-called deeper causes are what mediates, what encompasses, what incorporates the details. As late as the most recent past, the preponderance of the trend could be read in the facts themselves. Specifically, military acts such as the bombing raids on German cities functioned as slum clearing, retroactively integrated with that urban transformation which has long been observable around the globe and not in North America alone. Or, the strengthening of the family in the emergency situations of refugee life did temporarily slow down the tendency to anti-family developments, but it hardly stopped the trend. In Germany, too, the number of divorces and that of incomplete families kept increasing. Even the Spanish conquests of Old Mexico and Peru, which have been felt there like invasions from another planet, even those, irrationally for the Aztecs and Incas, rendered bloody assistance to the spread of bourgeois rational society, all the way to the conception of one world that is teleologically inherent in that society's principle. The trend can never do without the facts, but ultimately such preponderance of it within the facts makes the old-fashioned line between cause and occasion look silly. The whole distinction, not just the occasion, is external because the concrete cause lies in the occasion. If courtly mismanagement was a lever of the uprisings in parts, even that mismanagement remained a function of the total picture of the absolutist putting out economy. That's what outgo meant, the putting out economy. Lag behind the capitalist income economy. Moments which, as in the French Revolution, run counter to the historical totality while doing only so much more to promote it, such moments derive their potency from that historical totality alone. Even the lagging productive forces of one class lag only relatively, not absolutely, behind the advanced forces of the other class. One has to know all that to construe a philosophy of history, and it is for this reason, as much as for any other, visibly in the cases of Hegel and Marx already, the philosophy of history comes as close to historiography as historiography itself, the insight into the essence veiled by the facticity it qualifies, has come to be impossible except as philosophy. Adorno was already living in a time when the grand narrative of history had come into disfavor, and when a more particularistic historicism, without any grand narrative, without any kind of notion of underlying historical process, that was already coming to the fore in Adorno's own time, and really took over in the era of postmodernism after the 60s. Right. And yet Adorno is saying, nonetheless, really it's the Hegelian philosophy of history that keeps the meaning of history alive, but not as affirmation, rather as critique. Right. So if you were to disintegrate that trend in the particular facts, you would also lose the ability to critique the movement of history and capitalism. Okay, we've gone over a little bit. I don't want to keep you guys too late. We'll have a little bit more breathing room on Thursday night because the readings are less, and the points are more specific, but hopefully we've laid the foundation for them. We're basically going to be dealing with the writings in Adorno's last year of life, in 1968-69, which happened to coincide with important events in the world, as we will see him commenting on. Okay, have a good night, guys. I'll see you on Thursday.